When people think of Hong Kong, they may imagine the towering skyscrapers that span over the cityscapes, the shiny new Porsches that people drive, and the kind of lavish lifestyle that the millions of ultra-rich people living there lead. Hong Kong is indeed the wealthiest city in the world. Hong Kong had 111 billionaire residents, the second largest such population among urban centers in the world. More than 500,000 Hong Kongers, or 8% of its residents, are millionaires. Despite the city's wealth, Hong Kong's housing crisis is a big issue. More than 1 in 5 Hong Kongers, or 1.65 million people, were living in poverty in 2020, the most since record-keeping began 12 years ago. The housing crisis in Hong Kong is one of the most pressing issues that the city is facing. Now average home prices exceed $1.3 million in a city where the minimum wage is just $4.82 an hour. Even a skilled worker in Hong Kong must work 21 years to afford an average 650 square foot apartment near the city center, the longest such period in the world, according to a 2019 report from UBS. Other serious consequences of the city's astronomically high housing prices include the prevalence of tiny cage homes, subdivided flat, partitioned rooms, and people resorting to sheltering in fast food restaurants. Cage home originated in the 1950s in response to the sudden population increase spurred by refugees of the Chinese Civil War and baby boom brought on by a prosperous economy. The first were metal bunk beds with frail wire walls, hence the common phrase, cage home. Rent for a cage is 1,500 Hong Kong dollars to 2,000 per month, or $192 to $256. Located in the hearts of urban districts, these properties were made to hold more people than they should. Although it seems that certain human rights are violated here, they haven't yet been eradicated due to the demand for low rent. Subdivided flats, home to some of Hong Kong's poorest people, are mostly found in old tenement buildings that are poorly maintained, with tenants often having to share the kitchen and toilet. There are more than 100,000 such units across the city, housing about 226,000 people. These units had an average size of only 121 square feet with a monthly rent of 5,000 Hong Kong dollars or $642. To those who are unfamiliar with Hong Kong's geography, there is always a perception that Hong Kong is characterized by a shortage of land and a dense population, which is partly correct, but untrue in another sense of looking at the issue. The truth is that Hong Kong has a lot of land. And the apparent land shortage refers to a shortage of land that is readily available for development. Hong Kong has 1,114 square kilometers of land area in total. Up to now, less than 30% of it is developed. Take a guess at the percentage of land devoted to residential housing. Here's the residential urban space, just 7%, which is nearly evenly split between urban high-density housing and rural low-density housing. Next we have all other urban areas, including commercial sites and infrastructure such as roads, railways, government facilities and the airport, use 18% of land. So what occupies the biggest portion of Hong Kong? It's green spaces, country parks, coastline, reservoirs, waterways and agricultural land. Given the fact that the 7.6 million Hong Kong people need to be packed in the 25% developed area in the territory, it is no surprise that Hong Kong has such a dense population problem. Hence, the real issue is not really a lack of land, but really how to make land available for use. This is the tricky point, and there is no simple solution. Theoretically, there is still 75% of undeveloped land in Hong Kong, and the territory should have a lot of land development potential. But the undeveloped area has a lot of restrictions on future development. The Hong Kong government is deeply involved in the housing market, nearly 3.3 million people or 45% of the population living in public housing, a phenomenon that dates back to the post-war years. Housing policy in Hong Kong in the past 70 years encountered several critical junctures that set it on paths of development leading to present housing condition. The first critical junction was in 1947 when the government chose rent control in the face of a massive influx of immigrants. Between 1945 and 1948, the total population in Hong Kong increased from 600,000 to 1.8 million, and it kept growing. Most of the arrivals were housed in existing pre-war housing stock in cramped conditions. To protect Hong Kong residents against rising rents, the government introduced rent controls in 1947, but this had devastating consequences because it became extremely difficult to evict existing tenants and almost impossible to tear down pre-war units for reconstruction into taller structures. Rent control was thus a critical juncture because it prolonged the severe shortage of housing and land in Hong Kong. The second critical juncture was in 1954 when the government decided to use squatter resettlement to clear occupied land for development. The new housing policy relocated squatters into publicly provided resettlement estates after the land was cleared, but it created perverse incentives for households living in crowded tenement blocks to opt to become squatters with the expectation that they, too, would be resettled in time. A major problem with the resettlement policy was that it was not aimed at accommodating low-income families, but only at squatters who became homeless after their units were demolished. There was no means test. This sowed the seeds for discontent in society. Many honest, law-abiding, low-income households living in cramped old tenement units naturally felt aggrieved because they were losing out to opportunistic squatters, many of whom were not poor but were willing to live in illegally built squatter units. The third critical juncture was in 1962 when an ad hoc plot ratio amendment was enacted to reduce the amount of redeveloped land space. But it had an odd loophole that allowed for approval of work plans submitted before January 1, 1966. This loophole triggered a disastrous building rush that swept through Hong Kong between 1962 and 1965. Landlords used all means to submit building plans ahead of the deadline because this was a now-or-never decision. Tenant eviction reached enormous proportions when old congested buildings were torn down. The living conditions of many evicted from their homes worsened considerably. Because the government is inextricably involved in the housing market, many argue that responsibility for the crisis can be attributed to failures of government policy. The government's current land sale system contributes to the city's exorbitant housing prices. The People's Republic of China currently owns all of the city's land, apart from the land of St. John's Cathedral, which is the only piece of freehold land in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government is able to lease this land to the public. Developers have to bid for the land that the government leases, and whoever makes the highest bid is granted the lease of the land. The bid has to reach a minimum quantity, the estimated value of the land, which is based upon restrictions on how the land can be used, the conditions of the lease, and market developments. If this minimum quantity is not reached by any of the bids, the government will cancel the sale of the land and instead try and resell it in the future. Housing developers are expected to pay 3% of the rateable value of the land on the day it was leased in the form of government rent throughout the term of the lease. The remaining 97% of the rateable property value must effectively be paid up front. This significant land premium results in powerful land developers dominating the market, as they are the most capable of financing such a significant land premium. Additionally, this system of granting leases to the highest bidder can consequently result in the housing prices being driven to extreme heights. In recent years, Henderson Land Development Co., one of Hong Kong's largest developer, won a prime land plot along Hong Kong's famed Victoria Harbour with a record-breaking bid of 50.8 billion Hong Kong dollars or $6.5 billion US. Many have also criticized how government action and policies have resulted in significant portions of land being either completely unavailable for development or not being developed for high-density housing that could most effectively meet the growing city's needs. Hong Kong's controversial small house policy, first introduced in 1972, allows for male indigenous villagers who own land within their villages to obtain a building license, at no cost, to build their own small, low-density homes. If the land that they already own is unsuitable for housing development, they can exchange their land for a piece of government-owned land. Male indigenous villagers who do not already own land can apply to lease a government-owned piece of land in the village at a discount. Not only is this policy controversial due to its discrimination against women and its benefits being offered only to indigenous villagers, it is also problematic because it is unsustainable. There will not be enough land to meet the claims of every eligible villager in the long term. 1/5 of Hong Kong's urban areas, 5,000 hectares, is currently reserved for the implementation of this policy. This land could be used towards more high-density land development that could also effectively help address the housing shortage and lower housing prices. Some have accused private developers of hoarding significant portions of land that could otherwise be used towards housing development. According to government estimates, major developers may hold up to 1,000 hectares of rural land, which could satisfy a significant portion of the estimated need for 1,200 hectares of land to meet housing demand. Many developers hope to earn significant profits from acquiring land through shell companies and middlemen to otherwise conceal their involvement, and then hoarding this land while awaiting a rise in prices. Developers started buying farmland several decades ago, for as low as 10 to 20 Hong Kong dollars per square foot in areas that were inaccessible by public transport, and for 100 Hong Kong dollars per square foot in areas closer to motorways. However, developers have denied hoarding land. Instead, they blame red tape, lack of transport infrastructure, and stifling urban planning rules as the reasons for delays that had contributed to the housing shortage. After authorities announced in 2007 that homes would be built, they took 10 years to complete studies, planning and public consultations before proceeding. The first residents are only expected to move into the area's new private housing in 2023 or 2024, almost 2 decades after the plan was first unveiled. Two common hurdles to creating a new town were the lack of road access and a mass transit railway station. The application process to convert agricultural land into residential land, some of which is zoned as Green Belt under the city's Environmental Protection Ordinance, could involve more than 10 government departments. Besides land premium negotiations, approvals by different departments, including the Town Planning Board, will be a pain for developers. Even the biggest developers find it too difficult. Henderson Land Development, Hong Kong's biggest farmland owner in Hong Kong, hasn't been able to satisfy Town Planning Board requirements for the past 20 years for its private housing estate. Mike Wong Chik Wing, Deputy Managing Director at Sun Hung Kai Properties, said, "We secured approval from the Town Planning Board to convert a site near Tai Lam Chung Reservoir in Tuen Mun into a 1,800-unit project with a gross floor area of 9 million square feet in 1996. We still have not received a land premium offer from the government. It has been stalled for 23 years due to complicated processes required by different departments." Meanwhile, large pieces of land in the new territories are sitting idle and grossly underutilized, including Tso or Tong land, held in the name of a clan, family or Tong, and does not belong to any single villager or individual. There is around 2,400 hectares of such Tso or Tong land scattered across the new territories, and much of it sits in the middle of large sites that could be developed. Many clan members are eager to sell their Tso or Tong land, but the intended sale often fails to materialize. Under the new territories ordinance, each Tso or Tong is required to appoint a manager, and the manager must obtain the consent of the relevant district officer for a sale to go ahead. For many years, district officers would only approve a sale when there was unanimous consent from all clan members. Even where there was a single objection, they would choose not to process the application. Hong Kong's housing crisis is driven by lack of political will, not a land shortage. The main strategy the government is employing to promote the provision of more affordable housing is land reclamation and the creation of artificial islands. It has launched the project Lantau Tomorrow Vision, which aims to reclaim 1,700 hectares of land, expected to house 700,000 to 1.1 million people by creating an additional 400,000 homes. Work is expected to begin in 2025, and people will begin moving onto the artificial islands by 2032. The project has met with controversy and opposition for its high cost of estimated 500 billion Hong Kong dollars or $63.8 billion US dollars, amounting to half of the city's fiscal reserves, as well as environmental concerns. Critics have called into question whether increasing the land supply in projects like Lantau Tomorrow Vision is truly the most effective solution to Hong Kong's current housing crisis. A more effective solution could be to first identify current problematic government policies and systems, including the land sale system, policies that allow for the unsustainable use of land such as the small house policy, and the lack of legislation that prevents the hoarding of land for profitable gain. The government could then evaluate the impact of each of these contributing factors on the housing crisis and address these issues in order of severity.